this power, to train the youth to be thinkers and not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts. Now, you've heard that before. It's not a new passage. What do you think it means? What do you think Ellen White's talking about? Our devotional discussion today may be just a tad a little longer than we usually should be, but it's the beginning of the semester. Yes? By the way, sorry for interrupting you. If your name isn't on the list, please just add your name to it. So that's your case. Add your name. Yes, go ahead.
I was just saying, you God is full of all thoughts. He wants to, intellectually have understanding of things. It's not just to receive information.
Okay, good. So he wants us to have our own thoughts, not just passively receive information. Anybody else? Question is, I read that statement from Ellen White in Book Education, that true education, like we find it again, page 17, it is the work of true education to develop this power, to train the youth to be thinkers and not mere reflectors of other men's thought. So, what do you think she's talking about? How are you a reflector? How are you a thinker?
So let's take, for example, your fourth sermon, you're executing a passage of scripture, right? Now, you can just go and run off to the Sunday Bible commentary and read exactly what they say, or you can wrestle with it yourself and think about it. What, play around with it, check different areas of scripture, see how you get, stuff like that.
Okay, so when you're preparing a sermon, you can either get the sermon from somewhere else, or you can develop it yourself. By the way, that's an interesting example because I've been asked to do the commentary in 2 Kings for the commentary. And some of the editors apparently want the commentary to include lots of sermon material. Yeah, and that's different from what you're suggesting, right? Because what you're suggesting is the sermon material doesn't have to be there. It comes from the preacher. Just the information needs to be there, right? Okay, Matthew.
Yeah, I was going to say in addition to what Gordon said, especially on what Mike said, I think it's also critical to how God has gifted you, how that giftedness could lead to the path of calling God. Because a lot of times, some guys will try to look at other men who are before them and just assume that God has really given them the same gifts or abilities of the predecessors who've gone before us. So what we have to do in being thinkers and not mere reflectors is we need to function in our lane. Function in the lane that God has called us to.
Look at you.
So in other words, don't try to be someone else.
Right, don't try to be the identity of someone else. Be yourself as the Lord builds you and grows you.
I think that that passage starts with true education. It doesn't just say any kind. It says a true education, and I think that what it might be leading to is education from what you study in school, and then the education that comes from the Spirit Himself, and He educates you. So I think that I think that in all our classes that we do, for example, if we're planning to write something or even do a presentation, we have to use both those combinations. We cannot just rely on the Holy Spirit and not do any work and study and stuff like that. And at the same time, we also need to have the Spirit alongside with what we've been taught, and we working together in order to bring about that true education. And I think sometimes individuals may lead to just one and just take one method, but I think it's a combination of both that makes a true education.
Okay. So true education involves a combination. It's not just one side. Anybody else? Yes, divine power and human. Okay, anybody else? Now, this is something that's very important for this class. So basically, the whole year, both semesters of Old Testament, are not just covering the Old Testament, but they are, in essence, teaching you how to interpret the Old Testament. And so one of the things I hope you will get from this course is not just how to study the Old Testament, knowledge about the Old Testament, but how to interpret any passage of the Bible and how to apply it. Now, when I read that statement, what did that give you? Context. All you had is just one sentence. And out of that one sentence, you could probably come up with 15 sermons. Okay? Except that when you take the context, then you realize some of those sermons are eisegesis rather than exegesis. Okay? So what is it that Ellen White meant when she talked about this? And quite often, and I'm glad you didn't go that way, but quite often when we talk about that statement, that we're supposed to be thinkers and not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts, quite often people think, oh, that's critical thinking. Okay? How to critically evaluate whatever is being given you and so on. That's not quite the direction she's going. Okay? So let me read you the context. The first sentence of the paragraph says, every human being created in the image of God is endowed with a power akin to that of the Creator. And what do you think that is? She goes on to spell it out. And the first word after that is individuality. Power to think and to do. So what is it in this paragraph anyway that Ellen White is focusing on as part of the image of God? The word individuality. Individuality. I'll get to you in a second. Okay? And then she goes on. The man in whom this, and of course in her days, the word man was used generically, meaning people. The man in whom this power is developed are the men who bear responsibilities, who are the leaders in enterprise and who influence character. And then she goes on to say, it is the work of true education to develop this power, to train the youth to be thinkers and not mere reflectors of other men's thought. So that context suggests she is not just talking about the books that you read. She's not just talking about what you learn in the classroom. Instead, she's talking about the fact that education should teach you to stand on your own two feet. That's the point. The point isn't a question of whether you have the mental powers to evaluate and take apart any theory that's brought to your attention. That's not the issue. The issue is when you're sitting in a board meeting and everybody says yay.
Come on now.
And you know that's not so. Are you willing to be the only one to stand up and say nay? That is the work of true education.
Come on.
To develop in you the ability to listen to God's voice rather than to listen to other people's voice.
Come on. Yes, sir.
That's what she means when she says to be a thinker rather than a reflector of other men's thoughts. Okay? Now, how does that translate into the classroom? Okay? In the classroom, yeah, students can challenge what the teachers say. I don't have a problem with that. But there's more to it than that. Okay? In education, you can divide the learning styles in many different ways. Incidentally, the latest research suggests there are not 3 or 4 ways in which people learn. Instead, there are hundreds and thousands of ways. So that no teacher can actually adapt to everybody's way of learning. Instead, the most important thing to do is to learn how you learn best. But that, okay? But having said that, in education, generally, learning styles can be divided into 1 or 2 basic ways. One is field-dependent and field-independent. What's meant by that? The field-independent learners are the ones who can learn on their own. You know, they're interested in something, they just take off and learn even without having a teacher. The field-dependent learners need their environment to go with that. Okay? In other words, the class must be doing this in order for them to do it. And by the way, that's reflected temperamentally in society too. You will see there's some Christians who are bothered by the fact that others aren't doing what they're doing because they're field dependent. You can't serve God unless your group is serving God. Okay? Now, in other words, you're being a reflector of other men's thoughts. Right? Okay. So how does that apply to learning style? Well, normally they tell us that those who are experts in teaching tell us that we should teach in such a way that we involve both the field-dependent learners and the field-independent learners. That's true. That's true. I agree with that. But I see more than that, because if I read Ellen White correctly, it means that my job is not just to adapt to both types of learners. My job is to help the field-dependent learners to become field-independent learners. My job is not just to give you content. My job is to help you to be able to stand on your own 2 feet, to train people to be thinkers. How does that translate? Well, the field-dependent learners need a whole bunch of students to be studying in order for them to get in the mood to study. The field-independent learner can study even though everybody else is just playing basketball. You see the difference? Okay, the field-independent learner can do their homework regardless of, whether everybody around them is just eating lunch or supper or, staying up to midnight. The field-independent learner doesn't care what everybody else is doing. They can do what has to be done regardless. Okay? And so, hopefully, as we go through the semester, I'm not just helping you to learn content, information. Information you can get online. You don't need me to give you that. Okay? I will be giving some information, but hopefully this class will also prepare you to do a lot of work, academic work on your own. Okay? So that's the purpose of education, and that is the other purpose of what I hope to be doing in this class. Okay, one of my former students came back to me and said, well, he didn't come back. When he came back on campus, we were talking, and he told me the thing that I learned the most from your class was, I asked him about the assignments, not the class. And he said, the thing I learned the most about this assignment was, I don't know what the purpose is, but the only thing I know is it helped me to learn how to do research. He said, good. That was the purpose of it. Okay. Okay. Anyway, so this is our devotion for this morning. Would someone like to have our closing prayer? Please,
Father God in heaven, you the author and creator of us all, and you the one who has endowed us with not only your spirit, but also created us in your image. We appreciate the fact that, God, you are the originator of us all here, that we'll be able to think, we'll be able to learn, and from this thinking and learning according to your spirit, we utilize everything of our learning to stand boldly for you. Father, each of us in here, as we're preparing for a path of our call that you place upon us, I pray that you would continually show us where you're leading us. And I pray that also, in light of what Dr. B has taught us this morning, I pray that each of us will strive toward the field independent learning. And that we, through it, Lord, we also would know that in order to reach that, we can reach out to you. And in reaching out to you, you would give us your spirit. You would endow us with the wisdom and knowledge of heaven to guide us on this path. We thank you and we praise you for this now as we enter this class. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
By the way, I will be assigning a day for each of you to have the devotional in this class. I'll put it up in the web. So probably not on Mondays, but soon. Now, we're going to continue with the topic. By the way, did a good sign? Okay, so let's see. Chad, Elijah, Alexis, Lamont, Julius Mercer,
You was talking about some of this.
What Bible is that? What Bible is that?
It's called Master Study and Master Bible. This one is good.
So we ended Wednesday by asking the question, how do we know that we have the correct canon of the Old Testament? By the way, I should say some things along the way throughout the course. Okay? We're going to look at the syllabus probably next week. If there are people who come to class late and all of that, so we didn't have a chance to talk about the syllabus yet. But one thing I'm doing this semester in terms of grading is you are graded for your attendance. Okay? So everybody starts out with 10 points for the semester. And this week, everybody has amnesty. Nobody's going to have any points taken off. Okay? But after that, every time you have an unexcused absence, it takes 1 point away from those points. Okay? So, but if you have an excuse, of course, that doesn't matter. Okay? So, get the word out to those who like to miss Fridays or something like that. Now, last time we talked about how the Old Testament that we have has the same books as the Hebrew Bible, correct? Mm-hmm. Just that the order is different. But the same books are there. But our Old Testament, the Protestant Old Testament, is different from the Catholic Old Testament. And both of them are different from the Ethiopic Old Testament. And all three of them are different from the Syriac Old Testament, and we probably could go on. Okay? So, question is, how do we know that the Old Testament we have is the correct one? Anyone? Yes, remind me of your name again?
Shannon.
Shannon.
Well, I did some research.
Good.
I guess the main thing that to think about is what's our definition of canon. Did man give canon? Did God give canon? And if God gave the canon, then means God must have specified books that you want to place them in. So we must first look at the books that God ordained to, or said individuals that
Okay. So it was a divine choice rather than a human choice. That's an important point. We're going to come back to it later. You're going to see how that plays out later. Amy, yes.
Yeah, I was reading in the book that, the folk that, I guess, put the canon together, they followed, they followed three tests, so to speak, for each particular book. And one of them was, does it agree with all the other things that have come before, so to speak? I forget the other two, but there were some tests that these guys were following.
Okay, so there were some criteria by which certain books were accepted in the canon. Okay, we're going to come back to that topic also. Okay, yes.
Yeah, I think one of the other tests was, how does it discuss not only God in terms of being the Father, but how does it discuss the triune God, and how does it discuss Jesus Christ in the context of salvation? So I think that was one of the other tests.
Okay, so again, you have a criteria here in terms of Christmas criteria. Okay, what else? Yes.
Also, if you look at some of the books of the Old Testament, you see that you actually see in the book where it was a name for it to be written. So God
Okay,
said, preserve it, or
yes.
write these things in the book to be given various to the children of Israel forever without the statute.
Okay, yes.
The other two were the authorship and the extent to which the book applies. So in other words, if the focus of the book or the audience was too narrow to a specific whatever, then usually it wouldn't fit in. It would have to sort of have a universal meaning that throughout humanity.
Yes, okay, so universal. We may run into a little trouble there when you look at the book of Obadiah. And we'll talk about that, yes.
No, it's because everything was previous, like it kind of, sets the tone for how he will be prophesied into humanity and save the world. I don't know what the other books actually speak of, but as far as the oneness that each one has to kind of lead up to the New Testament, I feel it's kind of hard. When I'm learning in Christian theology, it is not everyone has the same type of mentality as far as the relationship with God. And so everyone has their own independent relationship, but they all move in one. You know what I'm saying? So,
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so how do you explain that? Well, I'd like to propose, and we'll come back to the issue of criteria. I'd like to propose that we should begin with the example of Jesus. Okay? The Bible that Jesus used appears to match the Hebrew Bible. Okay? How so? Luke 24:44. Luke chapter 24, I think I have it wrong. For some of these I have the text that Luke 24, verse 44. While we're looking this up, before we read, who can remind us of the divisions of the Hebrew Bible?
The writings of the prophets.
Right, the law, the prophets, and the writings. And by the way, this semester we will cover the prophets. Okay? The law and the writings are covered in the second class. Okay? Which, by the way, should have gotten a new name. Anyway, so Luke 24, verse 44. Who has it? Who wants to read it? this is what he says to the disciples. Okay? These things were written about me, and where were they written? In law and the prophets and the Psalms. Now, when you look at the writings, the third section of the Hebrew Bible, what's the first book of that section? The book of Psalms. Yeah. Okay? So, Jesus was referring to those very same divisions of the Hebrew Bible. Okay? Matthew 5:17. You all should know this one.
Think not that I have come to destroy the law and the prophets, but I have come to fulfill.
Yes. And notice there Jesus talks about the law and the prophets. By the way, many translations say the law or the prophets, but that's a phrase, law and the prophets. Okay, so sometimes the Old Testament was referred to in the Hebrew Bible by the three parts, law, prophets, and writings, the law, prophets, and psalms. Some other times that was just abbreviated, the law and the prophets. So when Jesus talked about the law and the prophets, what was he talking about? He's talking about the entire Old Testament. Okay? He wasn't just talking about the Ten Commandments. He was talking about the whole thing. Think not that I have come to destroy the Hebrew Scriptures. I have not come to destroy, but to bring out their full meaning. Think? Yes.
Just one question, you're talking about the law, so does that mean like in the Old Testament, when you say like in Psalms 19:7, the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul? They're not just talking about the commandments, are they?
No? No?
They're talking about, I guess, the
Yes.
5 books of Moses.
Yes. Yeah, well, it has a broader meaning. You took Hebrew, so you should know the word Torah also means instruction. So it can refer to the 5 books of the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, I mean, but it can also refer to any instruction that comes from the book. You find the word Torah used that way often in the Bible. So, yeah, any revelation from God, but it could refer specifically also to the law of Moses. Okay, yes, right?
So in Matthew 5 verse 17, Jesus is talking about the law and the Psalms. He doesn't mention it, right?
Right, because sometimes the books of the Hebrew Bible are referred to in an abbreviated way, just as the law of prophets, rather than the law of prophets.
Which means that the listeners to say on that, is saying that the Old Testament was
Okay. Not just the Ten Commandments, the entire Old Testament. You know, many Christians say not just the Ten Commandments are done away. They just, the Old Testament is no longer necessary. Right? Okay? So let's go back to Luke 24. Luke 24, verse 27. Luke 24, 27.
And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures things concerning himself.
Yeah, notice, maybe I should have put this one before Matthew. Notice that here, all the scriptures are summarized as the law and the prophets. Okay, so sometimes you have all three mentioned, sometimes law and the prophets is what refers to the entire Old Testament. Now, look at Luke 11, 51. Luke chapter 11, 51. It's a very interesting passage. At first, it may not seem to be relevant for discussion, but you'll see how it's relevant. Okay? Jesus is, of course, rebuking the Pharisees, and this is what he says. Who wants to read?
Brother David to Brother Zachariah, who perished between the altar and the temple. Yes, I say to you, they shall be required of the generation.
Okay, so let's talk about how guilty they were. Now, of course, they couldn't be, the Jewish leaders couldn't directly be guilty of killing Abel, right? But what Jesus is saying here is that they're just as guilty. Their, their mindset has changed, hasn't been converted. Now, where do we find the story of Abel's? And what about Zechariah?
Yes.
Who's Zechariah, by the way?
He was a prophet.
He was a prophet. Okay. Was he a prophet?
Was he?
Was he? Well, he was a prophet in a sense because he was giving a message, but he's not the same prophet that had the book of Zechariah. He was a different guy. So
He was a priest.
he was the son of the priest. Yeah. And where do you find that story? It's not Kings, but
In New Testament.
Chronicles. 2 Chronicles 24. Let's read about it. Okay. 2 Chronicles 24, verses 20 to 22. Chapter 24, beginning in verse 20.
It says, "And the Spirit of God came upon Zachariah the son of Jehoiada the priest, who stood above the people, and said unto them, Thus saith God, Why transgress ye the commandments of the Lord, that ye cannot prosper? Because ye have forsaken the Lord, he hath also forsaken you. And they conspired against him, and stoned him with stones, at the commandment of the king in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash the king remembered not the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done to him, but slew his son. And when he died, he said, The Lord looked upon him and inquired of him."
Okay, so that is the story of Zechariah's death. Now, it's in the book of Chronicles. What's the last book of the Hebrew Bible? Chronicles. Chronicles. That's right. So, you see, this is why Jesus referred to these two events. Because one of them is in the first book of the Hebrew Bible, another one is in the last book of the Hebrew Bible. It's only like for us to talk about from Genesis to Revelation. So Jesus took some of these two to say from Genesis to Chronicles. That's the point. Okay? So, anyway, so these are examples that show us that the Bible that Jesus used appears to match the Hebrew Bible. That's the first point, okay? Or why we agree, why we think our canon is correct. Here's the second point, which is that there are other historical references to the Old Testament canon around the time of Jesus. Yeah, the passages here. You have to write these down. Right. 24 verses 20 to 22. Okay? There are other historical references to the Old Testament canon that come from about the same time. Okay? First, you have one from an earlier period, a few years before the time of Christ, and that's found in Sirach's prologue. Sirach, by the way, is in the Apocrypha, which is not part of the canon, but there's something interesting that you find here and there in some of these books. They're useful for historical reasons. Okay. Notice, who wants to read for us? I think there are 2 slides for this. Please, Ken.
Whereas many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others that follow them. My grandfather, Jesus, after devoting himself especially to the reading of the law and the prophets and the other books of our fathers, and after acquiring considerable proficiency in them, was himself also led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom, in order that, by becoming conversant with this also, those who love learning should make even greater progress in living according to the law. But
Go ahead.
what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. Not only this word, but even the law itself, the prophecies, and the rest of the books differ not a little as originally expressed. When I came to Egypt in the 38th year of the reign of Xerxes, and stayed for some time, I found opportunity for no little instruction.
Okay, now, this helps because of the date. Okay, so we know that it was written sometime after 132 BC, which is a century or more before Christ. Okay, but notice several times he talks about the law, the prophecies, and the rest of the books, right? You have the three divisions of the Hebrew Bible mentioned here. Okay? The law, the prophets, and the others. See? The law, prophets, and the other books. Okay? So you have the three divisions of the Hebrew Bible alluded to the Sirach, yes.
So from this slide, and you can conclude that since they were already talking about it, you use it to say the Old Testament canon is already in
Yes,
when it's trying to-
yes, it was. Now, historically, you see, there's a, you can look at it from two different perspectives. Or you can look at it from the perspective of the history of how the canon was accepted. And most books were identified. So there were certain decisions made in the history of Judaism and the history of the Christian church and so on. We had councils, and so there's this talk about the Council of Jamnia, which took place around AD 90 and so on. But that's talking about history. When the church, when different groups made statements about what the canon is. What we're talking about isn't the history of what they said. What we're talking about is how do you know, on what basis. Okay, so we're approaching this a little bit more from the theology rather than from the history. Now, the Council of Jamnia took place in AD 90, but that's more than 200 years after this statement, right? So even though the council made the pronouncement about which books belong to the Hebrew Bible, it's clear that it was already recognized that way long before the council made the pronouncement. Okay? Another example comes from another apocryphal book, 2 Esdras 14, okay? Verses 45 to 48. And again, you can find this in the Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha is useful to have, even if it's not part of the Bible. Okay? Notice, this is God speaking to Ezra here. And would someone like to read first?
Make public the 24 books that you wrote first, and let the worthy and the unworthy read them. But keep the 70 that were written last, in order to give them to the wise and the people. Warn them is the spring of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, and the river of knowledge.
Okay, notice he mentions 24 books. How many books are there in the Hebrew Bible? 24. Okay? And then he mentions another 70. The background to this statement is the fact that in Judaism, there's the tradition that God gave 2 laws on Mount Sinai. Okay? He gave the oral law and the written law. The written law is what you find in the Bible. Okay? Of course, beginning with the 10 Commandments, but everything else that was written down also. And the oral law is what was not in the Bible, which eventually got written down anyway, called the Talmud. Okay? So it's a reference to the Bible and the Talmud. And of course, according to Jewish tradition, he was to keep those separate. Okay? It's Protestant and Catholic Apocrypha. Okay? Actually, it's not. It's in the Catholic Old Testament. It's in the Protestant Apocrypha. Yes.
I mean, Dr. Lee,
Yes.
you said that in these, the 2 laws, the oral law and the written law, are from not all of them?
No. Did I say that? No, Mount Sinai.
Mount
Yeah,
Sinai.
I misspoke and I said no. Mount Sinai. Okay.
And so that's just, is that important?
No, that's just the background to understand what this statement is about.
Okay.
This is the tradition of Judaism, and you can see the second Ezra already understands that it's a tradition, okay? And that you have these 24 books mentioned, which is what the Bible is.
Just a side question, if it could be allowed, which religious group used most Talmud as one book? Was it
It's
described?
Judaism.
Oh, it's in Judaism.
What do you mean, which religious?
Well, like how you have the scribes and the sect.
Well,
Oh, the
okay,
sect.
yes,
Yes, that's the question.
the Judaism that survived to this day is basically Pharisaic Judaism.
Right.
So the Talmud records Pharisaic Judaism.
Right, that's the question I'm asking, because you know how Jesus was very aware of, and so astute on the laws and stuff like that. So I was also trying to find out, was Jesus also referring to the Talmud, because he knew that.
Yeah, many of these traditions are found in Talmud.
Right.
That Jesus,
Was referring to when he called them
yes,
out. He was trying to really point them to what is really important, which is what was testified of him.
right, yes.
Yeah. All right.
But you have reference to them, elsewhere also.
Okay.
Second Ezra talks about this,
Okay.
and so on. So, there are some other historical references also. Josephus.
Yes.
So some of these come before Christ, some of these come a little after Christ, but you have all of these references. Now, Josephus is interesting because what he says is a little bit different, but in the end, I think we can fit what he says into the same basic pattern. Okay? Who would like to read it? There'll be more than one slide.
We have not various of books disagreeing and conflicting with one another, but only 22 containing the record of all time and justly credited.
Now notice it says 22. We'll come back to that in a minute. Okay? Go ahead.
Of these, 5 are the books of Moses containing the laws and the history handed down from the creation of the human race right to his own death. This period falls a little short of 3,000 years, from the death of Moses to the time of Artaxerxes, who was king of Persia after Xerxes. The prophets who followed Moses have written down in 13 books the things that were done in their days. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and principles of life for human beings.
Okay, so he breaks it down in the number of books you have there, okay? And the last section is different from the arrangement of the Hebrew Bible that we're used to, because he says only 4 there. We'll look at that in a second. Okay? And go ahead, you want to finish that paragraph?
From Artaxerxes to our own time, a detailed record has been made. But this has not been thought worthy of equal credit with the earlier records, because there has not been since then the exact succession of prophets.
And we'll come back to that statement. Okay? Now, let's take Josephus' statement apart a little bit. Why 22 books instead of 24? There's some books that didn't make it to Josephus' canon, or yes?
And I get the idea that what if they were, like, some books were combined again, and then later on
Yes.
separated back out?
Yes. Yes. You can see that some of them may have been combined. Okay? That's true. Now, why 22?
What are the 2 books that are missing?
Now, we'll look at the 2 books that are missing or combined, but there's a significance to the number. How many of you have had Hebrew? How many letters are there in the Hebrew alphabet?
22, right?
It's 22, although when you learn Hebrew, Sin and Shin are separated into 2 letters.
Right, to make it 23.
But,
Yes.
remember the dots weren't written back then, so Sin and Shin
Right.
were the same character in Hebrew. Therefore, the Hebrew alphabet has 22 characters,
Right.
okay? And that's why probably Josephus's canon had 22 books. therefore, the number of books was probably, or not the number, but the books were probably the same, except that there may have been a tradition among the Jews of trying to make them fit the number of letters in the alphabet. Okay? So, if that's the case, then you can see that Ruth might have been included in Judges because it happened during the days of Judges. And Lamentations, part of Jeremiah because they're called Lamentations of Jeremiah. Okay? So that would give us 20%. Also, the way Josephus arranged his books shows that even though it was a commonly accepted division, commonly accepted organization of the Hebrew Bible, you think of 3 divisions, there was some fluidity in the actual arrangement of which books belonged to them. But probably, the books were the same. So the probable arrangement of the Hebrew Bible, according to Josephus, would be what? First, books were, 5 books of Moses. There's no reason why there'd be any difference. Genesis to Deuteronomy, right? Next, you have 13 books, but instead of going to the 13 books, let's go to 4 books and see if we can figure out which 4 they would be. Because it says what? They contain aims to God and principles of life. Aims to God, I mean, and Proverbs, definitely. So these are probably 4 books: Psalms, Song of Songs, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. That's what they have. Okay? And then let's go back to the 13. What would be left for us? Well, the 13 books would be beginning with Joshua. If you combine Judges and Ruth in one book, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, which was one book, Esther, Job, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Lamentations, combined in one book, Ezekiel, the 12, and Daniel. Okay? So, Josephus's list is very much the same as the Hebrew Bible, except for the order of the books.
Right.
Okay? Now, let's go back to the reasons why we think we have the right canon. Josephus gives a slightly different order, but probably has the same books. Number 3, there was a consensus that the prophetic word had ceased in the intertestamental period.
Yes.
Remember Josephus' statement at the end? He says what? The detailed record has been kept, but there has not been since then the exact succession of prophets.
Right, which is called the Intertestamental.
It is. Okay, so what did Jesus mean? Josephus mean here? Well, there's some debate about what he actually meant, but it's clear that Josephus is saying that there weren't always prophets during this period of time. Another reference again comes from the book of Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha. These are intertestamental writings, right? So, First Maccabees 9:27 says what? Who wants to read?
Thus there was great distress in Israel, such as has not been since the time that prophets ceased to be among them.
Since the time that what?
Prophets ceased to appear.
Prophets ceased to appear among them. Okay, so there's a recognition that the gift of prophecy had stopped. Right? Okay, First Maccabees 14:41. And the Jews and their priests decided that Simon should be their leader and high priest forever until what?
Trustworthy
Until
prophet should
a
arise.
trustworthy prophet should arise. Okay, so, outside of the Bible writings that came, during that